In the frozen silence of space, a 60-year-old capsule broadcasts a dying woman's heartbeat. Dr. Ivan Petrov spent decades dismissing cosmic anomalies as mere noise until he recognized the voice crying from the void. Now, as powerful forces race to incinerate the evidence, one terrifying question remains. What if the ghosts we silence aren't phantoms, but heroes demanding justice? Some truths refuse to stay buried in the stars. The universe, Dr. Ivan Petrov explained to the scattered handful of students in the lecture hall, was a place of profound and elegant predictability. His voice, a low baritone still carrying the faint, hard-edged ghost of a Russian accent, filled the cavernous room. He stood behind a wide oak desk, a fortress of order in a world of chaos. His notes were perfectly aligned. His pens were arranged by color. His life was a series of calculations, and for the most part, the numbers added up. The signals we receive from the cosmos, he continued, gesturing with one hand toward a complex diagram of cosmic background radiation, are not whispers from the gods. They are echoes of physical events, the death of a star, the collision of galaxies, the cooling embers of the Big Bang itself. They are governed by the laws of physics, laws that are consistent, measurable, and above all, rational. A young woman in the third row, her laptop covered in space-themed stickers, raised her hand. But what about signals that don't fit? Like the wow signal, something that looked designed but we never heard again. A flicker of something annoyance, weariness passed over Ivan's features before being suppressed. He adjusted his glasses. An excellent question, Ms. Albright. It brings us to the demarcation line between science and speculation, a concept defined by the philosopher Karl Popper. The principle of falsifiability. He savored the words, his intellectual shield. A theory is scientific only if it can be tested and proven false. The wow signal, as you call it, was an anomaly, a single data point. It cannot be retested and therefore cannot be falsified. We cannot build a hypothesis around it. So, scientifically speaking, it is not evidence of alien intelligence. It is simply noise, interesting noise perhaps, but noise nonetheless. He offered a thin, dismissive smile. The lecture was over. The universe was back in its neat, predictable box. That night, however, the box came open. In the deep silence of his immaculate home, in a study where every book was alphabetized and every surface gleamed, Ivan Petrov sat before the one object that defied the room's rigid order. In a corner, like a dark shrine, sat a vintage military-grade reel-to-reel radio receiver. It was a relic of another life, a heavy black machine with thick dials and a large circular green display that pulsed like a slow, hypnotic eye. He wasn't listening to music. He was listening to the universe's most fundamental song, the hiss of static. To anyone else, it was the sound of nothing. To Ivan, it was a library of ghosts. He closed his eyes, and the sterile quiet of his study dissolved, replaced by the damp, cold air of a concrete bunker 60 years in the past. He is 20 years old again. Headphones, heavy and tight, clamp over his ears, muffling the world. He sits at a console identical to the one in his study, a soldier in a secret, silent war. His designation is Signals Analyst, 3rd class, Soviet Air Defense Forces. His job is to listen, to sift the voices of NATO pilots and the chirps of spy satellites from the crackle and pop of solar winds. For months it has been nothing but routine, but tonight is different. Through the static, something emerges. It is faint, buried deep in the noise, but it is there, a rhythm, a soft, wet, organic beat. Thump, 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 a human heartbeat, and beneath it, a voice, a woman's voice, speaking Russian, her words distorted by distance and desperation, fragmented like dying embers. Nebo zovet. The sky calls, kolodno, tak, kolodno. Cold, so cold. Young Ivan's blood runs cold. He frantically adjusts the dials, trying to sharpen the signal. He records it, his hands shaking. He plays the tape for his supervisor, a thick-necked political officer who listens for less than a minute before scoffing and pulling the headphones off. "Ionospheric reflection," the officer declares, his voice final. "Solar flares bouncing radio signals from a Moscow broadcast back into our dish. It happens. Erase the tape. It is noise." Ivan had followed the order. He had erased the tape. But he had never been able to erase the sound. The next day, Ivan sat in the university lounge, the drone of daytime television a background hum to the task of grading papers on stellar nucleosynthesis. He took a sip of scalding hot tea, making a red mark on a student-s flawed calculation. His world was, once again, one of predictable inputs and outputs. Then a name on the television screen snagged his attention. Astra Prime. He looked up. The network was running a special report on the private space exploration company, fronted by its charismatic tech billionaire CEO, a man half Ivan's age with twice his confidence. The CEO was announcing their latest find. "Using our new deep space orbital debris scanner," the man said with a practiced smile, "we've identified a previously uncatalogued object in a decaying, non-standard orbit. We believe it to be an artifact from the early days of the space race." The screen cut to a grainy, computer-enhanced telescopic image. It was a sphere, slightly elongated, scorched and pitted from decades of exposure to the void. To the news anchor, it was a curiosity. To Ivan, it was a spectre. His breath caught in his throat. His hand went slack, and his red pen clattered onto the polished floor. He knew that shape. He knew the specific configuration of the antennae, the distinct silhouette of the re-entry module. He hadn't seen it in 60 years, not since he'd studied its blueprints in a classified briefing book. It was a Vostok-class capsule, but it wasn't a Vostok. It was the Zarya 3, the one that never came home. Back in his study, the daytime sun felt like an unwelcome intruder. Ivan's hand trembled as he held the phone to his ear. The calm, orderly world he had so meticulously constructed over 5 decades was fracturing. The dial tone ended, and a bright, cheerful voice answered. "Astra Prime Public Relations. How can I help you?" Ivan cleared his throat, forcing a steadiness into his voice that he did not feel. "My name is Dr. Ivan Petrov. I'm a professor of astrophysics. I am calling about the object your company has located." "The Cold War artifact?" the PR representative said. "Yes, it is very exciting. We are getting calls from museums all over the world." "It is not just an artifact," Ivan said, the words coming out faster now. "I believe I know what it is. In the 1960s, I was a signals analyst for the Soviet government. I monitored telemetry for the Zarya program. The capsule you have found its orbital path. Its design, it is consistent with the Zarya 3. It was a mission that was officially lost, a malfunction. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The cheerful tone was replaced by a cooler, more practiced one. "Dr. Petrov, we appreciate your interest. As you can imagine, we are being inundated with calls from enthusiasts and theorists. If you have any information you believe is credible, you can submit it through the official channels on our website. There's a form for public submissions." The condescension was a physical thing, a wave of dismissal that traveled through the phone. "You do not understand," Ivan insisted, his voice rising despite himself. "This is not a theory. I have records. I have..." He stopped. What did he have? A memory of a ghost. "The capsule," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It is not empty." "Thank you for your call, Doctor," the voice said, polite and final. "Please feel free to use the web form." The line went dead. Ivan was left holding the receiver, listening to the monotonous, empty hum of the dial tone. It was a different kind of static, a sound of absolute disconnection. The world didn't want his truth. They had their own story, and it had no room for 60-year-old ghosts. He slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. His frustration was a cold, hard knot in his chest. They called him a theorist, a crank, but he knew what he had heard, and he knew what was floating in the darkness, falling slowly back to Earth. The dial tone echoed in the silent study, a flat, sterile sound that mocked the storm brewing inside Ivan Petrov. He was a theorist, an enthusiast, a crank. The words stung more than any academic criticism ever could. For 50 years, he had built a life on the foundations of evidence, logic, and peer review. Now, the one time he held a piece of a truth so profound it had haunted his sleep for decades, he was dismissed with the wave of a corporate hand. The frustration was a physical thing, a tightening in his chest. If the modern world would not listen to the witness, then he would have to give them the evidence. Hard, undeniable, empirical proof. His feet carried him not to his desk, but to a small, unassuming door that led down to the basement. He descended the creaking wooden stairs into a space that smelled of damp concrete, sawdust, and time itself. Unlike the rest of his home, the basement was a controlled chaos of stored memories, the furniture of a life he had left behind, all shrouded in grey tarps, like sleeping giants. He moved with purpose to the far corner, pulling away a heavy canvas sheet. Beneath it sat a dark green metal steamer trunk, its surface bearing the faint stencil of the Red Army star. He hadn't opened it since the day he'd emigrated. The latches groaned in protest, stiff from long disuse. He lifted the heavy lid, and the scent of aging paper and celluloid filled the air. It was the smell of his youth. Inside, there was no chaos. Everything was as he had left it. A perfect, terrifying archive. Meticulously organized logbooks with thick cardboard covers, their pages filled with his own neat Cyrillic script. Stacks of canisters, each containing a reel-to-reel audio tape, their labels bearing dates, frequencies, and coded designations from the 1960s. He ran his fingers over a canister labeled simply Zarya 3 Anomaly. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up his arm. This was it, the physical manifestation of his ghost. For half a century, he had tried to convince himself it was a memory, a trick of the mind, a story. But here was the data, cold and real. The resolve hardened in his chest, pushing aside the fear. He was no longer just a haunted man. He was an investigator with a 50-year-old cold case. The next day, that resolve was tested. He was in his university office, the quiet sanctuary where his two lives, the professor of logic and the former KGB analyst, were meant to remain separate. But the past had just walked through his door. The man was in his 60s, dressed in a perfectly tailored but utterly forgettable grey suit. He was neither tall nor short, handsome nor ugly. He was a human void, designed to be overlooked and immediately forgotten. "Dr. Petrov," the man said, his voice as colourless as his suit. He extended a hand. Ivan shook it. The man's grip was firm and dry. "My name is Korolev. I am from the State Archives." Ivan knew a lie when he heard one. A man from the archives would be dusty and stooped, not possessed of this predatory stillness. "I was not aware of any inquiries from the archives," Ivan said, his voice steady. Korolev gave a smile that did not touch his eyes. "A small matter. It has come to our attention that you made an inquiry of your own, to a private American company, Astroprime." He sat, uninvited, in the chair opposite Ivan's desk. "You spoke to them of the Zarya program." The air in the small office grew thick and heavy. "It is a matter of historical record," Ivan said carefully. "Some records are more sensitive than others," Korolev replied, his voice dropping slightly. "History is not always a straight line, Doctor. Sometimes it is a tangled thing, and to pull on one thread well, it can unravel a great deal of careful work. We would consider it a great disservice to historical clarity if old, misinterpreted data were to be presented as fact." He let the words hang in the air. Certain chapters are best left closed, for everyone's sake. Focus on your teaching. It is important work. He stood, smoothed the front of his jacket, and gave a slight nod. A pleasure to meet a man of your stature. And then he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a faint chill and the suffocating weight of his unspoken message. The threat, so elegantly veiled, had the opposite of its intended effect. The cautious academic in Ivan was terrified. But the young soldier, who had heard a voice from the void, was enraged. That night, Ivan turned his study into a laboratory. He brought the Zarya 3 tape canister up from the basement, his hands reverent. He placed his vintage reel-to-reel machine on his desk, its analog heft a stark contrast to the sleek modern laptop beside it. He ran a series of cables, connecting the past to the present, the machine of secrets to the machine of information. He threaded the fragile brown tape with practiced ease. He hit play, the speakers filled with the familiar oceanic hiss of deep space static. It was the sound that had been the backdrop to his nightmares. He opened a piece of professional audio restoration software on his laptop, its interface a complex landscape of frequencies and waveforms. For hours he worked. He wasn't just guessing. He was using his deep instinctual knowledge of the specific distortions caused by C-band transmission through the Van Allen belts. He applied a dehiss filter. He isolated a narrow frequency band. He painstakingly peeled away layers of solar noise, like an archaeologist brushing dust from a fossil. And then it happened. A single clear peak appeared on the digital waveform. He isolated it, amplified it, and from the speakers, a sound emerged, purer and clearer than he had ever heard it before. Thump, 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 thump. The heartbeat. His own heart hammered against his ribs in time with it. And then, the voice. It was no longer a fragmented whisper, but a clear, melodic, and desperately sad voice. A woman, speaking into the abyss. Nebo zovet domoi, she whispered. The sky calls me home. Tears streamed down Ivan's face. It was real. All of it. The memory wasn't a phantom. The ghost had a voice. Awe and terror washed over him in equal measure. He was not mad. He was a witness. The validation was a fire in his blood. He could no longer wait for the world to come to him. He had to force it to listen. His hands, now shaking not with fear but with adrenaline, moved swiftly across his keyboard. He couldn't go through the front door of Astra Prime. They had already thrown him out, and Korolev had made it clear that the official channels were guarded by monsters. He would have to find a side entrance. He recalled a name from the Astra Prime technical blog, a post about deep space signal processing that he had admired for its ingenuity. Lena Rostova, lead systems engineer. She was a scientist, a datasmith. She would understand. He opened an encrypted email service, creating an anonymous account. He isolated the 10 clearest seconds of the audio. He had restored the heartbeat and the 4 Russian words. He attached the file. In the body of the email, he typed a single line, not of text, but of code. It was the precise frequency, down to a dozen decimal points, on which he had received the transmission in 1965. No name, no explanation, just the data. He hovered his finger over the mouse. This was the line, the one Popper had spoken of. He was stepping from the world of peer-reviewed science into the shadows of conspiracy and covert action. He was becoming one of the theorists he so publicly disdained. He took a deep breath, and he clicked, send. The data was out in the world, an echo sent back into the sky, aimed at the one person who might understand. In the heart of Astra Prime-S mission control, Lena Rostova was chasing a ghost. The vast, curving wall of screens before her displayed orbits, satellite statuses, and endless rivers of data, but her focus was narrowed to a single window on her personal console. In it, the telemetry from the derelict Soviet capsule, designated Object 3B7, was a chaotic scribble of noise. For 2 days, she had been trying to find a signal within the static, a meaningful whisper in the digital blizzard. Her superiors had already written it off as a dead husk. But Lena's intuition, an instinct honed by a decade of listening to the cosmos, told her there was something there. A soft chime announced a new email, bypassing the corporate spam filters to arrive directly in her priority inbox. The sender was anonymous. The subject line was blank. Her training told her to delete it immediately. Her curiosity, the engine of her entire career, compelled her to open it. The email contained only two things: a string of numbers, a precise frequency designation, and a single, small audio file. Frowning, she put on her headphones and clicked play. The sound that filled her ears was old, the analog warmth of magnetic tape unmistakable. There was a hiss, and then a soft, rhythmic beat, a heartbeat. Beneath it, a woman's voice, speaking 4 desperate words in Russian. Lena's breath caught. She ripped the headphones off and stared at her screen, her mind racing. She pulled up the telemetry from Object 3B7. The frequency Ivan had sent it was in the exact range she had been analyzing. A hunch, wild and unprofessional, sparked in her mind. It wasn't just an audio file. It was a key, a filter. With quick, practiced fingers, she wrote a short piece of code, instructing the system to process the Capsule's raw signal using the properties of the anonymous audio file as a baseline. She executed the command. The chaotic scribble of noise on her screen wavered, then began to resolve. The random hash of static collapsed into a clean, repeating pattern, a perfect digital waveform. She zoomed in, her heart pounding. It was a sequence of structured pulses, a digital heartbeat, and its rhythm matched the one on the audio file with 0 deviation. Lena leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. The old guard had dismissed the anomaly, but she, a member of the new generation of science, driven only by data, had just found the ghost in the machine. The coffee shop was crowded and noisy, the perfect place to be anonymous. Ivan sat at a small table in the back, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in front of him. He had been waiting for 20 minutes, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He was about to meet the recipient of his desperate digital message in a bottle. A young woman entered, scanning the crowd. Her eyes met his, and she navigated the tables toward him. It was Lena Rostova. "Dr. Petrov," she said, her voice quiet but confident. She sat down, placing her laptop on the table between them. She didn't ask him who he was, or how he got the file, or why he sent it. She respected the necessary secrecy of the moment. Instead, she opened the laptop and turned it to face him. "I believe you, but I wanted you to see why." On the screen were 2 waveforms. The top one was labeled analog audio, source unknown. It was the signal from his tape. The bottom one was labeled telemetry, Object 3B7. It was the signal from the capsule. They were not similar. They were identical. A perfect, undeniable match, separated by 60 years and the vacuum of space. Ivan stared at the screen, a lifetime of doubt and secret shame dissolving in a single moment of validation. A shaky breath escaped him. "The frequency," he started. "It was the key," Lena finished, her eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. "It let me filter out the solar interference. You were right. It's been broadcasting this whole time. A repeating low-power loop. A heartbeat. A fragile alliance was formed in that instant. A bridge of trust built not on words, but on the pure, irrefutable language of data. The old world witness and the new world explorer were now partners. Their newfound hope was short-lived. The next day, the serpent entered the garden. Mr. Korolev, the man from the State Archives, sat in the plush leather chair opposite Astroprime's CEO. The mood in the panoramic office, which usually buzzed with energy, was tense and cold. Korolev slid a thin, official-looking file across the polished desk. "This is from our colleagues at the Russian Space Agency," Korolev said smoothly. "The object you have located has been positively identified. It is a prototype from the Zarya program. a failed one. Its experimental nuclear power source is decaying. It is, to put it bluntly, volatile. The CEO paled slightly. Volatile? Is it a danger to other satellites? That is only part of the concern, Korolev continued, his voice grave. There are international sensitivities. The program was a source of great embarrassment for the Kremlin. Any attempt to retrieve it, especially by a private American entity, would be seen as a deeply provocative act, an act of political aggression, even. And if there were an accident during the attempt, a safety catastrophe broadcast to the world. He let the implication hang in the air. The CEO, a man who lived and died by stock prices and public perception, leaned back, his expression grim. The grand adventure of recovering a piece of history suddenly looked like a political and financial minefield. We will, of course, respect the wishes of the Russian government, the CEO said. Our official position will be that the object is unstable. We will monitor it until it deorbits naturally. The decision was made. The official narrative was set. The truth was to be sacrificed for the sake of stability. That night, Lena Rostova made a choice. Her career, her reputation, her future, she placed it all on the altar of scientific truth. In the silent, after-hours glow of mission control, she sat at her console, defying the direct order from her CEO to stand down. On her tablet, propped against a monitor, was the face of Ivan Petrov, speaking to her on a secure, encrypted video call. The old Vostok capsules had a diagnostic backdoor, Ivan said, his face a mask of grim determination. A maintenance code. It was designed to be used with a high-gain antenna to wake up a dormant system. No one has used it in 60 years, but the hardware doesn't forget. He recited a string of alphanumeric characters. Lena's fingers flew across her keyboard, inputting the obsolete code, routing it through the massive DSN-4 deep space communications array. She was using a cannon to whisper a secret code into the darkness. "The pulse is away," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They waited. 1 second, 10, 30. The console remained silent. Ivan's face fell. "Perhaps it is truly dead," he murmured. And then the screen flashed. A torrent of text streamed down her display. It was raw, unformatted, but it was clear Russian. Lena read it aloud, her voice trembling. "System failure. Life support critical. Capsule designation. Zarya 3. Ivan slammed his fist on his table in triumph. "It's her! It's really her!" Their victory lasted for less than a second. The initial message was followed by a flood of corrupted data, a digital scream of garbled characters and error codes. And as they watched in horror, a final, chillingly clear message pushed through the noise, flashing in stark, red letters at the bottom of the screen. Biohazard protocol active. The blood drained from Lena's face. Ivan stared, speechless. They had found their ghost. They had learned her name. But Zarya 3 wasn't a tomb. It was a warning, a quarantine zone, and it was falling toward them. The red letters on the screen, Biohazard protocol active, pulsed in the dark of mission control. A digital scream that echoed across the secure connection to Ivan's study. The line went dead as Lena, panicking, slammed her laptop shut. For Ivan, the world narrowed to a single terrifying thought. They know. The polite warnings from Korolev were over. The men who dealt in quiet threats were now coming to deal in silence. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. His academic life, his carefully ordered existence, had just evaporated. There was only the evidence. He grabbed a worn leather satchel and began frantically sweeping his life's work into it. The logbooks, the codebooks, the precious reel-to-reel tapes that held the voice of Zarya 3. Every rustle of paper, every creak of the floorboards was magnified into an approaching footstep. He was just stuffing the last of the tapes into the bag when the sound came not a knock, but the explosive crack of splintering wood as his front door was kicked off its hinges. He didn't hesitate. He ran. Two figures, swift and silent in dark clothing, swept into the living room. Ivan scrambled for the back of the house, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled with the lock on the kitchen door, his fingers clumsy with terror. Too slow. He could hear them moving through the house, a methodical, terrifying search. He looked at the window above the sink. Without a second thought, he grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet, swung it hard, and shattered the glass. He threw the satchel out onto the overgrown lawn, then awkwardly clambered through the jagged opening, slicing his hand on a shard of glass. He didn't feel the pain. He grabbed the bag and plunged into the darkness of his unkempt backyard, disappearing into the suburban wilderness, just as the dark figures appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was a fugitive. The respected Dr. Petrov was gone, replaced by a hunted old man with a bag full of ghosts. The motel room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. The buzzing neon sign outside cast flickering, sickly shadows on the grimy walls. This was Ivan S.'s new reality. His hand was crudely bandaged with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. Spread across the stained bedspread was the entire archive from his steamer trunk, the physical remnants of a secret history. Propped open on the rickety table was a cheap laptop, and on its screen was Lena S.'s face, pale and grim. "They've locked me out," she said, her voice a tense whisper. "My access to the deep space array is revoked. My CEO is avoiding my calls. They're trying to shut me down." "They are trying to shut us both down," Ivan corrected, his gaze fixed on the corrupted data packet she had on her screen. "Which means we are close. What can you do?" "I saved the raw data packet before they cut me off," she said. "I can restore some of the corrupted code fragments, but the underlying protocols, they're 60 years old. The encryption is archaic. It's nothing I've ever seen." "But I have," Ivan said. He reached for a thick, leather-bound book, its cover stamped with a faded KGB crest. Obsolete protocols were my specialty. For hours, they worked. A strange, desperate synthesis of old and new. Lena, in her state-of-the-art apartment, used powerful algorithms to stitch together broken lines of code, restoring fragments of telemetry and text. She would send them to Ivan, who, hunched over his codebook in a forgotten motel room, would translate the obsolete commands and cross-reference the military-grade encryption keys. It was a painstaking process, like assembling a shattered mosaic in the dark. A fragment of a medical chart, a line of garbled text, a series of navigational coordinates that made no sense. They were two minds, separated by a generation, working as one to decipher a message from the dead. Slowly, painfully, a document began to take shape. The final key was a password Ivan found in his codebook, one he hadn't thought of in decades. Almaz 1, Diamond 1. He typed it in. The encryption broke. The corrupted file resolved into a single, clean text document. It was a mission log, a final testament. Lena shared her screen, and they read it together in horrified silence. Its author was Cosmonaut Ludmila Orlova. The text was part official log, part personal diary. It revealed the true nature of Zarya 3. It was no exploratory mission. It was a secret, joint project between the military and the Politburo's Science Division, an experiment to test the effects of a newly weaponized, spaceborne virus on a human host in zero gravity. Ludmila was not a victim of an accident. She was a patriot, a volunteer for a suicide mission, chosen for her iron will and her absolute loyalty. She knew she was never coming home. The log chronicled her last days. The initial entries were clinical, describing the onset of symptoms. Then, as the virus and the profound isolation took hold, the logs became feverish, poetic, fragmented. She wrote of hallucinations, of seeing faces in the stars, of the cold blackness of the sky calling to her. The whispers Ivan had heard 60 years ago, they were Ludmila's final, delirious diary entries, broadcast on an open channel as her mind broke. The Biohazard protocol, they learned, was automated, designed to activate upon the cessation of her vital signs, locking the capsule down and turning it into a floating tomb. Ivan stared at the screen, his face ashen. The ghost that had haunted him for 50 years had a name. She was not a phantom, she was a hero. A sacrifice to the monstrous, unchecked hubris of men who saw science not as a tool for discovery, but as a weapon. As this devastating truth settled over them, a shrill alarm suddenly blared from Lena-S speakers. Her face went white with shock as she switched windows on her computer. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." "Lena, what is it?" Ivan demanded. She looked at him, her eyes wide with panic. "It is the capsule. Someone is accessing it. It is a state-level override. It has to be the Directorate. They've initiated a forced deorbit, a full-power burn." "A recovery?" Ivan asked, a sliver of hope in his voice. "No," Lena said, her voice cracking. "Look at the trajectory. It is too steep. They're not trying to recover it. They're going to burn it. They're incinerating the evidence in the atmosphere. They're incinerating the evidence." Ivan's words, spoken from a grimy motel room, reached Lena through her laptop speakers, but she was barely listening. Her eyes were locked on the trajectory data. The men in the shadows were using the raw, brute force of orbital mechanics to erase their sins, turning a piece of history into a cloud of vapor. An alarm screamed through mission control, a soulless, digital shriek announcing the imminent destruction of Object 3B7. Her career was already over. Her CEO had ordered her to stand down, but this was no longer about her career. It was about Ludmilla. In a move of pure, calculated defiance, Lena-S fingers flew across a secondary keyboard. She bypassed the main flight operations and accessed the network for Astra Prime-S orbital maintenance fleet. A nearby Stingray drone, a small, fast vehicle designed for satellite repair, was on standby. It wasn't built for this. Its purpose was to gently nudge satellites, not to chase a fireball through the upper atmosphere. It was their only chance. With a few sharp commands, she rerouted the drone, disengaged its safety protocols, and pushed its engines to 110%. The small drone detached from its station and accelerated, a silver needle aimed at the heart of the growing firestorm that was once Zarya 3. Lena was no longer just a scientist. She was a rescue pilot, on a mission to save a 60-year-old soul. The final act began. The screen in Lena-S control room split, one side showing the drone-S camera feed, a terrifying view of the disintegrating capsule, glowing plasma licking at its scorched hull, the other showing Ivan's face, a ghostly image broadcast from his motel room hideout. The room was a cacophony of sound and light. "She's tumbling on the Y-axis," Ivan yelled, his eyes glued to the telemetry data Lena was feeding him, cross-referencing it with the faded diagrams in his logbook. "The heat shield is compromised on the port side. It's creating an asymmetrical drag." He was no longer a weary professor. He was the young signals analyst again, interpreting the death throes of a machine he knew like the back of his own hand. "I see it," Lena responded, her fingers a blur on the console. "If I try to match the tumble, the torque will tear the drone apart." "Don't match it," Ivan commanded, his voice cutting through the static. "Anticipate it." The 1965 model had a nitrogen-based attitude control system. It will fire in 3-second bursts to try and correct. It's failing, but the impulse is still there. Use the pattern. Let it push the data port toward you. It was a frantic, desperate ballet. Ivan, the old-world priest, interpreting the omens from his sacred texts. Lena, the New World surgeon, translating his analog prophecies into precise digital commands. The drone dodged a piece of shedding insulation, its small thrusters firing in perfect time with the capsule's dying spasms. The capsule shook violently, a groaning, tortured sound traveling even through the vacuum of space as its internal structure began to fail. On Lena's screen, the drone's manipulator arm, a delicate limb of carbon fiber and steel, extended slowly toward a small, scorched panel on the capsule's hull. "Almost there," Lena whispered, her face illuminated by the glow of the console. Just a few more meters. The drone's arm was inches from the data port when a series of explosions ripped across the capsule's surface. The structure, weakened by the intense heat and pressure, was coming apart. "Lena, get it now!" Ivan screamed. She slammed a command key. The arm shot forward, the magnetic clamp at its tip locking onto the port just as the main capsule disintegrated into a blinding, silent fireball. For a heart-stopping second, the drone's camera feed was pure, white light. Lena's screen filled with error messages. "Signal lost," she said, her voice hollow. Then, through the static, a single progress bar appeared on her screen. "Data transfer in progress." It was filling, agonizingly slowly. 70, 80. The fireball on the screen was fading, leaving nothing but a trail of glowing dust. 90. And then the bar vanished. The screen went black. It was over. For a moment, there was only the sound of Lena's ragged breathing in the silent control room. Then, 2 green words flashed on the screen, a message of impossible victory. Transfer complete. A single triumphant tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't celebrate. She didn't pause. With a cold, methodical fury, she dragged a file containing Ludmila's log, her voice, her truth, her legacy, into a distribution folder. A folder linked by secure server to every major news network on the planet. Her finger hovered over the mouse. This was the final act of defiance. This was for Ludmila. She clicked, execute. Weeks later, the world was a different place. Ivan Petrov sat in a new, simple apartment, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. A small television on the counter was playing a news report. The Zarya 3 scandal had toppled governments, ended careers, and rewritten the history of the space race. The screen showed a photograph of a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a brave smile, Ludmila Orlova, no longer a ghost, but a hero known to the world. Ivan looked across his small living room to the corner where his old radio receiver used to sit. The corner was now empty. The space was filled with sunlight. For the first time in 60 years, his home was completely silent. There was no static, no whispers from the void, no ghosts demanding to be heard. He had listened, he had told her story, and now she was at peace. Ivan took a deep breath, the air clean and still. He looked out the window at the clear blue sky, the same sky that had once called to Ludmila, the same sky that had carried her voice to him across an impossible distance. He had spent a lifetime believing that science was the act of silencing superstition. But he had learned it was something more. It was the act of listening to the whispers, no matter how impossible they seemed, and finding the truth buried within. The ghosts were finally silent, and so, at long last, was he. What's fascinating about Ivan's story is how it flips our usual expectations on their head. We start with a classic conflict. The man of science, who trusts only data, being haunted by what he believes is a superstition, a ghost in the static. The official explanation he was given, ionospheric reflection, was clean, rational, and wrong. It was a lie. The superstition, the folklore of a lost soul whispering from orbit, was treated as noise. Yet, in the end, that ghost story was the more accurate narrative. It wasn't a literal ghost, but it was the echo of a real person, a real death, a real tragedy. The superstition was the only thing pointing toward the truth. The official scientific explanation was the actual deception, a tool used to bury a monstrous secret. It makes you wonder about the nature of these stories. The scientific method is our best tool for understanding the universe, but this story suggests it can also be used to create sophisticated lies. The ghost story, in this case, wasn't the opposite of the truth. It was a distorted, desperate fragment of it. It was the only evidence that survived. This leaves me with a question, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. When a story has been dismissed as folklore or superstition for decades, how do we know if it is just a myth, or if it is the last remaining voice of a truth someone tried to silence?